Hey y'all, so this video will contain all of my true stories that came out in the month of February. The first story is a news story written by me based on somebody's true experience and read by my friend Wondrous Library. All the other stories are stories that appeared on my channel in February. After listening, please go to his channel to have 3 news stories, one narrated by me, and make sure to subscribe while you're there. Enjoy.
The creepiest thing that ever happened to me was once when I was fishing. This happened in a lake that was not too far away from my house. I walked there, partly through the town, and then partly through a bit of woods to get there. There was a path that led down there. Then, I walked around the shore until I came to this old dock that I always went fishing on. Now, one of my favorite things about fishing in this area was that not a lot of people really did. And that meant I could often be by myself for a very long time. And this morning, when I first got to the lake, I was the only person there. So I found my spot on the dock and began fishing. I suppose the downside of fishing there might be why not many people fish there. The fishing was never really great, but that's the thing about fishing. It's not always about catching something. It can often simply be about having some nice and peaceful time. And for the lack of fish biting, I was still having a nice and quiet time on the beach by myself. As I was sitting there, I did see someone on the far side of the lake. He didn't look like he had any fishing equipment with him, but he walked up to the shore and he stood there for a while. It was a very small lake, so I could tell that he was looking at me and made me feel a little uncomfortable, but I tried not to pay much attention to it. But I did keep trying to give him a look from time to time, from the corner of my eye, and after what seemed like a very long time, he finally stopped watching me. The man started walking along the shore of the lake. I was a bit relieved to no longer be the object of his attention. I was just happy. Soon he would be away, and then I would feel comfortable then. As I continued to watch the man, however, I noticed something. He wasn't walking away from the lake. He was walking around the lake. And after a while, I noticed that he was getting closer to me then. Immediately, I began to feel uncomfortable again. I guessed he could have just been a guy who was out for a walk. If not for the fact that he had been staring at me for that long period of time, I just had to seem like I didn't notice what he was doing. The man got closer and closer to me. When he was passing by the dock I was sitting on, I just knew that he was right behind me. I didn't see him out of the corner of my eye, walking. He may have taken the path I used to get there, but I didn't really believe that. I just knew that this weird man was behind me. Suddenly, I heard someone ask from behind me,
"Are the fish biting?"
I nearly jumped out of my skin. I spun around and I noticed the guy standing behind me. He had a weird smile on his face. I composed myself and told him that they weren't biting just yet.
"Too bad,"
he responded. I tried just to go back to my fishing. The whole time, expecting this guy to begin talking to me again. I mean, I would have been happy if he would have done anything, not least of all going away. But he didn't do anything. He just stood behind me, and I remained immensely creeped out. My day was ruined, but I didn't want to just get up and leave. I tried hanging on for just a little bit longer. And then I had an idea. I pulled my line up, and pretending that something was messed up with the hook, I reached into my toolbox and pulled out my fillet knife. Then, making sure that the man knew what I was doing, and making sure that he saw the knife, I cut the wire. That did the trick. He knew I had a knife, and immediately after, he began walking away. Now, while this might seem like a relief to many people, it wasn't really to me. By leaving, when he saw the knife, it confirmed to me that he was up to no good. Once he knew I had a weapon, he decided not to take his chances. He walked back across to the other end of the lake, looked back at me, and then left. I promptly went home. It was a long time before I ever fished there again.
Snow Walk. I had a really weird experience years ago during a snowstorm. It had begun snowing earlier in the day, and the snowfall simply got thicker and thicker as the day and the evening wore on. Anticipating the snowstorm, my job had canceled the workday, so I had been home the entire day. I am not really the type of person who likes to be indoors all day, so by the time I got later in the night, I began to get a little stir-crazy. I was watching the snow from out of my apartment window, hemming and hawing over whether I thought it was a good idea to take a walk in the snow. There didn't seem like there would be too much in the way of visibility. It really wasn't the smartest thing to do, to walk out in a storm like that. However, I was bored. When I got outside, the first thing that I noticed was that strange, almost calmness and lack of wind that you very often get while it is snowing hard. I mean, I'm making the assumption that all of you have experienced this before, and I don't know that for sure. But many times for me, when I have been outside during heavy snowfall, it seems like there isn't much wind. And then, the wind tends to come in full force after the snow stops and the sun comes out. I don't know, I always found it strange and yet calming, which was the point I was trying to make. The snow had piled up pretty good by that point. There was at least a few inches of snow, and there was also a satisfying scrunch as my hiking boots pressed down into the virgin snow. I always liked that feeling. Although I wanted to go for a walk, I also knew that it wouldn't be a good idea to get too far away from my apartment. There didn't seem to be any end in sight for this hard snowfall, and the more it piled up, the more difficult it would be to walk in. I decided that I would walk a couple of blocks from my apartment building over to a pharmacy that I often frequented. I would go there and get myself a drink or something, and then head back home. The walk there was pretty uneventful, but there was someone there that I thought I may have recognized. If you've ever seen someone, and you sort of know you have seen them before, but you cannot quite place them, this is exactly what I was feeling when I saw this man at the store, and I figured that he must have recognized me from somewhere as well. He followed me around in the store a little bit, and you know how some stores have slanted mirrors on the corners of the ceilings? I caught him watching me more than once in those mirrors. I was not really nervous, unnerved, or whatever you want to call it, just from catching him watching me. For me, it was nothing more than just being curious as to who he was. One of the most aggravating things is just barely being able to recognize someone, and ultimately not being able to put two and two together. I bought some hot chocolate to make when I got home, so I could keep watching the snow fall. I got something to eat too, although I don't remember what. But I left the pharmacy without figuring out who the person was. I started on the way back to my apartment. As I walked along, though, I don't know what it was, but something made me turn around and look back down the block. Keep in mind that the visibility was very bad, since the falling snow was so thick. But I noticed someone walking behind me, about a half a block or more away. And of course my mind started playing tricks on me. Part of it was trying to make me think that it was definitely the guy that I had seen in the store. And that was plausible, actually, because I hadn't encountered anyone else walking out in the snow that night. Plus, he was paying very close attention to me in the store. And also, I think the person following me was the same size as that guy was. I tried not to think about it, but of course that just made me think about it more. I began to get pretty nervous, shooting glances back several times. If it was that guy, and he was following me, then obviously he would know I was aware of it. So I was nervous while I was walking along. However, the one thing that gave me a little bit of calmness was that he never began walking faster, and he never caught up with me. The man did, however, follow me all the way over to my apartment building. I got in, closed the security door, and did not look back. I simply went into my ground floor apartment and didn't turn on any of the lights. I was thinking by doing so that if he was out there watching, that would be a dead giveaway as to which apartment I was in. I think I let about 5 minutes pass before I did anything. Still not turning any lights on, I just peeked through the blinds in one of my windows. This time I was able to confirm it was the guy I had noticed in the pharmacy, and he was hanging outside my building in the snow. I watched him smoke a cigarette, pace back and forth in the light of a street lamp, and in the moment he was done with the cigarette, he lit another one right away. The man did not notice me watching him from the window, and that was when I finally recognized him. 5 years earlier, when I was in college, I was at a party at a frat house. I had stumbled into a bedroom by accident where a guy had forced himself onto an unconscious girl. He had been arrested, and my catching him in the act was a main part of him getting convicted and going to prison. And this man had followed me home from a pharmacy, likely recognizing me long before I recognized him. And now he was standing outside my apartment building, probably watching for me to turn the lights on or to look out at him. I didn't either. I also didn't call the police. I figured I was safe in my home, and he hadn't really done anything to me yet. I just kept the lights out, and never made it obvious that I had entered that apartment. Eventually, although it took a while, the guy finally left. The following day, the apartment manager informed everyone that one of the ground floor apartments had been broken into, and a man was arrested. Yes, it was the guy who had followed me home, and he had entered the apartment of one of my neighbors while they were sleeping. Fortunately, no one was hurt, but that man did another stint in prison for what he did. Snow hike. I noticed that people do a lot of hiking and camping stories on the scary channels on YouTube, but I don't really ever hear scary winter hiking stories. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person who could have experienced something like this, but a good friend of mine and myself went on a mountain hike years ago and had a pretty terrifying experience. I understand the number one knock people have over hiking in wintry conditions. It's cold, and you're always going to be cold in some ways, but there are a million ways to keep warm when hiking in the cold. I don't need to go into that. I know that's not what you're here for, but I wanted to give everyone who might not be into winter hiking an idea of what it is like. My friend Joey and I are experienced winter hikers. We were very experienced when we went on this hike too, and it might have been that experience It helped us to keep our nerves during what happened. Either way, both of us are still here to tell the tale, so that at least is something very comforting to know. Plus, we have gone on plenty of hikes since then. Anyway, we were hiking out to a certain mountain. In the first few days, as seems to be the case in a lot of these stories, everything went along just fine. The weather didn't do anything out of the ordinary. We were fully prepared, and it was smooth sailing, or hiking if you prefer to try and use accurate terms. In the fourth night, we had found 2 trees that were absolutely perfect for us to set our tent up in between. And it was that night, also, that the weather took a first unexpected turn. We weren't supposed to get snow at all for the entire trip, but that changed that evening. We had seen the clouds moving in, and it was quite obvious there was going to be some snow. Even with the snow coming, we had no reason to not feel good about our fortunes. With the trees where they were, and the angle of the hill, we were going to be sheltered pretty good. So when we got into the tent and got ready to hunker down for the evening, the 2 of us were still in pretty good spirits. Despite a little fear concerning the trouble that the snowfall was going to cause us, we were able to fall asleep pretty easily. I wasn't sure how long we had been asleep when I felt Joey shaking me to wake up. When I got up, he told me to be quiet and to listen. When I did, I heard what I assumed to be an animal howling, but it was unlike anything I had ever heard before. It was a nasty and sorrowful wail that chilled me even more than the snow did. The 2 of us had absolutely no idea what this sound could have been coming from, but it was definitely an animal, and like nothing we had ever recognized. We could have written it off as not too weird, until after about 10 minutes of this howling, we began hearing these explosions. They weren't gunshots, they were just the strangest sort of explosions. I mean, if I had to guess, they sounded like a lot of grenades exploding. Both the odd howling noises and the explosions were moving closer and closer toward our tent. Over a period of about 20 minutes, we heard them getting closer, and we, of course, got extremely nervous. We were sure at one point that the howling seemed to be within 50 yards of us. Fortunately, though, the noises began to move away. They were definitely related somehow. We never heard what sounded like more than one creature howling, and each time it was followed by those weird explosions. Eventually, after about 90 minutes, we stopped hearing either. We continued our hike the following day. We looked for any physical signs supporting or explaining the weird noises we had heard that night, but we found absolutely nothing. To this day, we have never been able to identify what we had heard, and we have never heard it again. Snow drive. I didn't get my driver's license until much later than most people in the United States get theirs. My family really didn't have the money for me to get my own car, and I was way too involved in trying to get into college and to try to get a scholarship to be able to work any job where I could make enough money to get my own car. So it wasn't until I actually went out to college and then got a small job that I finally had to get a license. Before having a license, I was dependent mainly on public transportation. I do have to admit, however, that there were a few times when I'd missed the last bus or train. Sometimes I would have to take very long walks, but the few times when someone pulled up alongside me on the road and offered me a ride, I would take it. Afterward, I would always tell myself that I was so thankful that if I was ever in a similar situation to give someone who needed it a ride, I definitely would. This happened to me when I was in college. I had driven into the city one night to visit the clubs, and I wasn't aware that at the time there was a snowstorm moving into my area. It wasn't until after a nice long night of dancing and hanging out, and then me finally wanting to go home, that I went outside and noticed how challenging this was going to be. It was snowing hard, and judging by the accumulation on the ground, it had been doing that for quite a bit. I hadn't had much experience driving in the snow, so I was doing my best to simply be as careful as I could. I decided to stay off the freeways and just take the back roads home. I was nervous enough riding on the freeways during good weather conditions. I didn't want to even try to do it during the heavy snow. After getting far enough away from the city, I was driving on a long stretch of road when I noticed someone hitchhiking on the side of it. I have to admit that I was a bit hesitant to pick someone up because I hadn't done it before. But then I remembered all of those times that someone had stopped and given me a ride, and in none of those times was I ever in as bad weather as this guy was. So I pulled over and offered him a ride. At first the guy seemed pretty nice and grateful that I offered him a ride, but I also noticed how he didn't give me a destination to drive to right away. I asked him a few times and he avoided the subject, talking about the weather and then finally asking me where I was going. I let him know the university I attended and that I lived in the dorms there. It was after I told him this information that he got quiet for a moment, as if he was thinking something over. The guy's demeanor and reluctance to tell me where he was going made me very nervous. I was now regretting having picked him up, recalling every scary hitchhiker story I'd ever heard in my life. Finally, after a long silence, the man told me that he was going to a friend's house. That friend lived in an apartment building in the next town. He then told me that he was headed over to his friend's place for a party, and wondered if I was interested in coming with him to the party. Well, it was like 2 a.m. by that point. We had driven a couple miles so far with him in the car. I totally didn't buy the story that someone was walking to a party the next town over during a bad snowstorm at 2 o'clock in the morning. That was just a fishy story. I told him I thought it was a bit late, and I really needed to get back to the dorms. I couldn't take the chance of getting snowed in. He kept pressing it though, telling me it would be fun. He also began telling me that I could sleep over tonight and go back to the dorm tomorrow. And no matter how much I tried to keep telling him no, he really tried hard to convince me otherwise. When I finally got to the apartment complex that he was talking about, there were no apartments with their lights on. He tried again to convince me before giving up, thanking me for the ride, and then getting out. At first I felt relieved and was about to drive away when I saw the man reach into his pocket and draw out a pocket knife. He quickly moved towards the front of the car and made as if to stab the front tire with the knife. I had not put the car in park, so I quickly stepped off the brake and hit the gas, pulling away from the creep as quickly as I could. I saw him in the rear view as I took off. It didn't take me long to discover that he had punctured my tire. However, I rode on the flat for a while to try and make it over to a gas station. I went in and told the clerk what happened, and he called the police. I waited until after they arrived, and one of the officers was nice and even helped me change the tire. The police easily picked up the guy. He obviously knew the town, but didn't have a place in that apartment complex. They found him on the side of the road. I am not cynical enough yet to come away from this story with the idea that no good deed goes unpunished. I have tried to do nice things for people before it happened, and I continue to do nice things for people after it happened. However, I'm a lot more careful about who I attempt to do these good deeds for than I was beforehand. The well. I don't really recall ever doing anything particularly creepy or scary when I was a kid. I bring this up because I've read a bit of stories about creepy things children do or say. And also I bring it up because my daughter did something creepy a few years back that still haunts me to this day. This may sound harsh, but I don't believe in supernatural things. I know that a supernatural answer would explain things a lot easier than another answer might, but I just cannot bring myself into believing those things without direct and empirical evidence. Kids have vivid imaginations, plus they interpret things differently than adults often do, and this can explain a lot of the odd things that children do and tell you. Getting on with the story though, I have one daughter. She's 13 now, but this happened when she was 8 years old. I also have to tell you that she does not enjoy watching horror movies. She won't even listen to scary stories on YouTube when I do. So if this was something that was totally in her head, I cannot explain where the idea came from. This occurred on an early fall day. I remember the leaves falling down quite steadily, and there was a nice cool breeze. My daughter, Terry, wanted to go out and play. I had made sure that she had a jacket on and told her to remain in the yard, where I would be able to see her. This was never an issue with her, so I wasn't concerned. While I was doing housework, though, I did happen to glance up out of the kitchen window in the backyard. I did not see Terry back there. This was not immediately a concern, however, as she might have been in the front yard. I was still sure she wouldn't leave the yard without permission, so I was not concerned. I went into the living room and checked the front yard, noticing that she was not out there either. Although I was not yet concerned, I did decide to go out and check the side yards. There wasn't an easy way to see them from inside the house, but before I did that, I called for Terry to see if she had come back into the house. I didn't get any response from her. Walking outside, I checked all around the house and was not able to find my daughter anywhere. She was not in the house. She was not in any of the yards. We had a forested area around our house that was fenced off with a wooden fence, but she wasn't supposed to go beyond the fence. And Terry was very aware of this, and she never went beyond that fence. I was concerned then, because one of the major reasons that we didn't want her wandering out of the yard was because there was an old well in the forested area. And although Terry knew about this, and she knew very well she was not supposed to leave the yard to go into that area, sometimes children do things that are simply and completely spurred on by curiosity. They do these things even when they are well aware that they shouldn't. I of course called for Terry a lot, but I didn't get any response. I called out at different parts of the yard of the house before going out to explore them at all. However, when no response was coming, I had to then go out and check the forest. Of course, I went over to where the old well was at first. If there was any chance that my daughter had gone that direction, or if anything had happened, it would be the most dangerous area for her to have been in. However, before I was able to get to the well, my daughter approached me in the woods. She was walking towards me from the direction that the well was in. I felt a big mix of relief and concern, since although Terry was okay, it was now practically confirmed that she was out at that well too. But it was the concerned look on my daughter's face that bothered me the most. I fired a few questions at her through my own panic. I felt silly throwing all that information out at her, but I was really concerned. The only question that seemed to get through to my daughter, though, was why she was hanging out there by the well. She knew she wasn't supposed to go anywhere near it. "It's because of the little girl," Terry told me. I cannot tell you the combination of being chilled and confused that immediately struck me with those words. When I asked her what girl she meant, her response was even scarier. "It's the little girl who lives down in the well." I asked what she meant, and she told me that it was the little girl in the well that called her over to the well. I didn't wait for her to elaborate. The first thing that I thought was that there was some girl who fell into the well and called out to Terry for help. Based on this information, I ran quickly over to the area where the well was. Crawling down into the well, I tried to see if there was a little girl in the well. But as I called out, I got no responses. I, of course, thought the worst. I just thought that the little girl had to have fallen into the well, and now was unconscious, or even dead. I tried quickly to decide if I should run to the house and call 911, or if I should remain there and try to wake the girl up. Turning to Terry, I asked her what the girl in the well had told her. When had she fallen in the well? Giving me a very odd look, Terry shook her head. She didn't tell me she fell in the well, my daughter informed me. She lives in the well. She wanted me to climb down and play with her. I have never, before or since, heard such a terror-inducing thing from a child. I was not able to determine that anyone was in the well. I don't really believe in ghosts either, as I mentioned, but I also find it hard to chalk something like that up to a young girl's imagination. I really don't know. All I could do in this instance was tell her that she must never, under any circumstances, go back to that well, and no matter what she hears, she should never climb into it. I explained how dangerous that would be. I didn't let her out of my sight for a long time either. To my knowledge, she never went back to that well. I also have no explanation for what happened. Walking home. Ever since he was 10 years old, I began driving my son to and from school. The school is not very far away, and all the students live in town, so there is no bus system for the students. The vast majority of students just walk to and from school every day. It's just normal. And up until he was 10 years old, my son Tony also walked to and from school. However, there was a very disturbing experience that happened to him when he was 10 that convinced me to never let him make that walk again. Tony has always been a positive kid. He had friends in school and he takes part in after-school activities. Nowadays he is in high school and he plays sports at school. He doesn't like the fact that I drive him to and from school now because he would rather walk home with his friends, but I just cannot allow that to happen. I mentioned Tony being a positive kid, but around the time he was 10 years old, he came home from school and seemed pretty depressed. I was not too overprotective at the time, and I knew that kids sometimes get depressed, so I didn't really address it at first. However, it went on for several days, and when it did, I finally had to address it. When I asked Tony what was wrong, he insisted that nothing was. When I pressed him on it, he became uncharacteristically upset with me and insisted that nothing was wrong. I obviously did not believe him. Something was obviously wrong, but I didn't want to continue to press him if he wasn't ready to talk about it. I also figured that it could have just been a mood swing or something, and that it was quite possible that nothing really was wrong. He may have not known why he was in a bad mood. This bad mood, however, went on for nearly 2 weeks, and at that point I just couldn't let it drop. I was very concerned about my son and had to know what was going on. His dad and I talked about it, and although I normally did all the major parenting stuff, and being a stay-at-home mom, he and I confronted our son together. We figured that would be the best way to get him to admit what was going on. Finally, with both of us talking to Tony, he told us why he was in a bad mood. A couple of weeks before, on the way home from school, he crossed through a playground that he always crossed through. It was normally empty that time of day, but there was a young man on the merry-go-round. When he saw my son walking through the playground, he got up and ran over to him. Apparently the man started talking to Tony about some pretty disturbing things. He told him stories about violent acts he had committed, and even told Tony he had murdered someone recently. He had gotten away with it, as no one had suspected him of the murder, but he felt he had to tell someone about it, and he figured that a 10-year-old boy would be the perfect person to tell, because no one would believe him. Tony asked the man to leave him alone, but this only made the man more persistent, in telling Tony some more awful things. When Tony threatened to tell his parents and have them call the police, that was when the man said the scariest thing of all. He told Tony that if he ever told anyone what was said, he would go to our house, kill both of his parents why Tony had to watch, before killing Tony himself. And when Tony didn't believe him, the man pointed out that he had already killed someone and gotten away with it. He would be able to do it again. Apparently, this man got some thrill out of tormenting my son going forward. He would be there in the playground the next few days. When my son tried to walk a different way home, the man went to the school the next day and waited for him to leave. On these walks home, he would grill my son to make sure he hadn't told anyone what he had been told. And when my son confirmed that he hadn't, the man would tell him all sorts of gruesome ways that he would torture me and my husband in front of Tony. I mean, the things that Tony told me that came from this man were shocking. I don't really want to repeat them all, but they involved things like skinning us alive and piercing our eyes with sewing needles. My husband drove to school the following day and watched as the man approached my son after school. He confronted the guy, and that is the nice way of putting it. The man was arrested, but his murder story was never confirmed. He spent no time in jail. Ever since then, I have driven my son to school and home every day, and I will keep doing that until he goes off to college. Hide and seek. The worst thing that ever happened to me happened to my son when he was 11 years old. We lived on military base housing. This was in the early 1980s. It was not unusual at all for the time, and for the area, to allow kids to play out at night. There was a strong and very close-knit community, and always large groups of children playing. It wasn't unusual to have up to 30 children playing hide and seek or tag or something. In addition to the time and community, this also made it common and seemingly safe to let your children play outside after it got dark. We never really thought about it being dangerous. This was a normal summer evening, and my son Bobby was outside playing with the other kids in the area. They had been out for several hours playing hide and seek, or as they called it, hide and go seek. It was a large crowd of kids as usual. They were playing for hours, and continued to play after it got dark. Bobby is a competitive guy nowadays, and he was very much like that when he was a child too. And playing hide and seek, he was always determined to not be found, and he was always determined to do whatever it took to not be caught, and forced to be it. My husband and I were watching television when our other son came home. He was a bit frantic and told us that Bobby was missing. We asked to elaborate. He told us that about an hour earlier they were playing a round of hide and go seek, and every single kid had gotten to base except 2. One was caught and was it. The other child was Bobby. They called for Bobby to come out of hiding, but he didn't come. After calling for him several more times, they combed the area, calling for him and searching for him. No one was able to find any trace of him at all. So my husband went out to search for Bobby while I called the housing security. The military housing had their own police force. This was another reason we didn't worry when the kids were out playing late. They reacted quickly and went searching for my son. That night, no one found Bobby. Any parents hearing this story could understand how we felt. The absolute terror that pervaded our minds and bodies was unlike anything we had experienced before, or really since. We thought the worst. We thought it was more than possible that Bobby was dead. And that is a feeling and a thought that no parent should ever have. The following day, we got a phone call from the police. They had found Bobby. That was the good news, but what happened to him was pretty scary. While playing hide and seek, Bobby had gone behind a fence and had the misfortune to come across a couple of drug addicts. One of them overdosed and had died, and the other was freaking out. When he noticed Bobby, he worried even more, scared that Bobby would call the police and he would get arrested. The living drug addict abducted Bobby. He taped my son up and threw him in the trunk of his car, and he left him there. It was the following day that my son, still in the trunk of the car, that the moron decided to drive somewhere, and he was pulled over for speeding. Bobby, aware that there was a police officer there, made enough noise in the trunk to get the officer's attention. The man was promptly arrested for kidnapping. Of course, the man was not honest about his intentions for Bobby. It doesn't make sense that he would have been, because it would have likely gotten him much more jail time. However, this was only a couple of years after Adam Walsh had been kidnapped and decapitated, so we of course expected the worst. Fortunately, the man was an idiot. He was convicted of the kidnapping and another charge related to the death of the other drug addict. I don't know what happened to him after that. Bobby is in his 40s now and lives quite a happy life. I do sometimes get scared, thinking it could have been very close to not happening. Catwalk. I had a really weird experience with a cat one time. Looking back on it, it is just one of those things that I have a hard time explaining. I tend to walk just about everywhere. I have a car, but for health reasons, I think it is important for me to go out and get some exercise. I live only a small ways out of town, and in a relatively safe area, so I will take walks during the day, during the night, whatever. On this particular night, I was not feeling tired at all. I was up late and I heard a notification on my cell phone. My direct deposit had gone through for my paycheck. I decided to go ahead and go to the store. I had been broke for a few days and eating nothing but ramen. So I got up and headed out for the store. Now, I hadn't gone very far when I noticed a kitten across the street from me. The very moment the kitten saw me, it came prancing over to me. This is not the first time I had something like this happen to me. The kitten brought a smile to my face because it had this spunky energy about it. Its tail stuck straight up and it ran over to me. As I walked along, the little cat did its best to keep up with me. It's always funny to think about those 4 little legs moving so fast in an attempt to keep pace with me. Normally, when a similar thing happens, the cat following me does not do it for very long. I might get down the street with my companion before something new catches its eye and it goes off. But this time, the kitten kept following me. I actually began to worry because, even though it was nighttime, I have to cross a highway in order to get where I was going. If the kitten decided to leave me near the highway, then I would have to be worried about it getting hit by a car. I tried several things to get the kitten to quit following me. I tried to distract it. I tried to throw something and see if it would chase it. When all else failed, although it broke my heart to do it, I tried yelling at it. I figured if I was mean to it, it would run off. I would feel bad about it, but at least it might keep him away from the highway and alive. However, not even yelling at the kitten seemed to work. The poor little thing was determined that it was not going to leave me, no matter what. So the kitten stuck with me all the way down to the store. I opened the door and went in, convinced that when I was done shopping, the kitten would finally move on to someone or something else. However, I was proven wrong when I came out of the store and noticed it sitting right by the door. It was like the cat was waiting for me. I was amused, but also in a way relieved. If the kitten would follow me all the way back home, I could give it some food, and I would also know that it would be safe away from the highway. Just like before, the kitten just followed me again. I went all the way from the store, down the highway, across the highway, and right back into my neighborhood. The whole time, the kitten stayed with me. As before, his tail sticking straight up in the air, and those 4 tiny legs moving as fast as they could. When I got home, I was about to go inside. The kitten began meowing at me. I wasn't sure what for. I tried to let it know that I would only be a moment. I was going to go grab it some tuna for sticking with me through the entire walk. Also, because I thought that by feeding it, the kitten would remain by me and not go back to the highway. But the kitten seemed distressed, something that I hadn't noticed before. for the first time since I had seen it, I reached down to pick up the kitten. While I was petting it, suddenly, my living room light turned on. I froze and almost dropped the kitten. I lived alone. There was no reason my living room light should turn on. Someone had to have broken into my house. Taking the kitten, I ran to the side of the house. I pulled out my cell phone and I called the police. Then I remained by the house until the police showed up. Some person I did not know ran out the back door of the house. The police, however, quickly picked him up. The guy had prior assault and breaking and entering charges. It was weird. I cannot imagine that the little kitten had any idea someone was in my home. But if it had not gotten distressed, I would have gone into my house and most likely would have been attacked. Also, had the kitten not stuck with me the entire time, its distressed meow wouldn't have bothered me so much. Well, needless to tell you, I decided to adopt the kitten as my own. I named him Lion because he protected me from getting hurt, and I can only imagine a lion being the sort of cat that could do that. Gifts. Like many Killer Orange Cat fans, I love cats. Not only do I have 4 of my own, but I tend to feed the neighborhood cats as well. So it wasn't much of a surprise when I started finding parts of dead animals on my porch. It started with the back half of a lizard. I found it when leaving for work in the morning, and while there was initially shock at seeing this half lizard on my porch, I knew right away that one of my feline friends had left it as a gift. I removed a tissue from my purse and picked it up by the tail, hoping my feline friends didn't see me as I deposited it in the garbage can before getting into my car and searching for the Purell. I didn't really think much of it, and I found nothing else on the porch for another week. Then one morning I woke to find a dead mouse. Thankfully, it wasn't like the lizard, and in fact, I didn't even see that it was bloody. Into the garbage can it went, and I was off to work without another thought. Cats are predators, and when they're left outside like the ones in my neighborhood, they're gonna kill things, and sometimes they give them to their humans. It's like they think we're bad at hunting and they're trying to help. It's both sweet and grisly. So other than being curious as to which cat was leaving me gifts, I didn't really give it much thought at all. Over the next week I was gifted with the other half of a lizard, a mole, and sadly a baby bird. I was beginning to dread opening my door every morning. The little animals made me sad, and I was starting to wish the cat would finish his meals. I even began thinking maybe I should leave less food out, so the cats would be hungry enough to eat their kills. It was around the time that I was thinking this, when I opened my door to find a dead bird. That wasn't like the others. To my horror, its head was crushed. I had began leaving the house with tissues ready, and I quickly shrouded this bird in them and dumped it in the garbage. The image was burned into my eyes, and I spent my ride to work wondering if a cat could do that to a bird. I convinced myself that bird bones were just really fragile, and cats have strong jaws, so there was nothing strange about this bird. Not 2 days later, I was greeted with the most disgusting gift yet, a chipmunk with its belly torn open. I even had to pick up some insides off the porch. I threw up after throwing this one out, and by the time I got home from work, I had decided to stop feeding the neighborhood cats. I felt really guilty about it, but I knew that most of the cats had homes and were just getting fed regularly anyways. They were just coming to me for something extra. Obviously, whatever cat was leaving gifts was perfectly capable of getting his own food, and I simply could not deal with any more dead animals on my porch. At first, it seemed to work. I went 2 weeks without a gift, and then one morning I opened the door to the truth. This wasn't a cat. This had never been a cat. I knew this because a cat could never have done what I found on my porch. It was a squirrel. A dead squirrel. I knew this because the tail had been left intact. That cute, fluffy tail. Had it not been for that, I wouldn't have known what this strange lump of meat was, because there was no hint of fur or skin left on the animal. It hadn't been chewed on. It hadn't been gutted. It was just skinned, and the skin was gone. I shut the door and called the police. I told them about all the animals and having assumed it was a cat. They confirmed it was definitely no animal that left the squirrel. I don't know if the person doing this saw the police, or if the squirrel was intended as their final message, but it's been 6 weeks, and I've not opened my door to another gift. Thinking back over the different animals that had been on my porch, and the state of their poor little bodies, I just can't understand what kind of human being could not only do this, but then leave it on someone's porch, intending to freak them out. Just why? Why? Intruder. I have a black cat that I love to death. She has been getting on in the years, but she still has a little bit of pep in her step when she needs it. Black cats get a pretty bad rap in the world. I mean, everyone knows that a black cat crossing your path is a superstition that you'll have bad luck. Hell, even here in Chicago, people blame the collapse of the Chicago Cubs one season on a black cat walking across Wrigley Field. But black cats actually get a lot of hate from other people, and that sometimes includes people who own cats. They have a reputation for being evil, being devils, and this causes a lot of black cats to end up homeless, and it's pretty sad. I, on the other hand, adore black cats. I have had a few throughout my life. When my current black cat, Whitey, and yes, I gave her an ironic name, goes up to cat heaven, I will most likely get myself another black cat. But my scary story does involve my cat. But I had to get all that evil nonsense out of the way before mentioning it, though. She does have one scary feature that all black cats do happen to have, though. They disappear better in the dark than any other cats can do. I don't really have a lead-in for this story other than that. I do have some motion detection cameras in my house, though. I had a break-in years ago, and ever since then, I needed some security measures in my house. I did have an alarm, but it had developed problems over the years, and I never set it when I was in the house. I was sleeping, and suddenly I was woken by two noises happening at the same time. The first was the unmistakable sound of my cat Whitey, screeching like a freaking banshee. The second was the sound of a human being, in super obvious pain. I immediately knew that someone must have broken into my house. I live alone, so I should never hear a person in my house in the middle of the night. I grabbed my phone and immediately called the police. Well, the police got there, and the intruder had already left, but they caught up to him pretty quickly. Whitey was in the house, and she had a small limp, though fortunately none of her bones were broken. So what happened? Well, the security camera revealed that. A man broke into my home. He wasn't using a flashlight, just relying on his own vision, and I had seen him in several rooms, and he was in my living room. There was a jewelry box next to the chair that I always sit in. The man walked over to the chair and reached for the box, seemingly appearing out of thin air, but really just shaded by the darkness around the chair. Whitey jumped out of my chair with a vicious scream. It was hard to tell, but we realized when the man was arrested that Whitey had bit right into the flesh between the man's thumb and index finger, and she bit all the way through. The man had to shake the hell out of his hand over and over to finally get Whitey off him. She hit the wall, which is how she got hurt. But she also immediately got back up, and that is when the man fled the house. Whitey healed up just fine, and the intruder spent about 3 months in jail. I don't expect he will ever come back.